Some places don't call for help with voices, they call with silence, and only a dog can hear it first. The lake stretched wide and still beneath a pale gray sky, its surface smooth like glass, untouched by wind or ripple. Yet Rex stood at the edge, ears high, body tense, a low rumble building in his chest, as if something beneath the water had just spoken his name. Daniel Hayes pulled his worn jacket tighter against the cold, his breath drifting in slow clouds, watching the dog with quiet concern, because Rex didn't react like this without reason, not after everything they had been through together. At 40 years old, Daniel had learned to trust very few things in this world, but he trusted the dog beside him more than his own instincts. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, though the lake offered no answer, only that deep, unsettling stillness that seemed to press against the air. Rex took a step forward, then another, paws crunching softly against the gravel shore, his amber eyes locked on a point just beyond the waterline, and then suddenly he barked, sharp and deliberate, the kind of signal that once meant danger, or discovery, or something that didn't belong where it was. Daniel followed his gaze, squinting across the shoreline until he saw it, a shape near the reeds, half hidden by shadow, something that hadn't been there before, or maybe had been waiting all along. His boots sank slightly into the damp earth as he moved closer, each step measured, cautious, the old instincts returning like echoes from another life. And the closer he got, the more the shape became a man, lying still, one arm stretched toward the lake, as if reaching for something just out of sight. Daniel's chest tightened, not with fear, but with a quiet urgency he couldn't explain, and without hesitation he dropped to one knee beside him, checking for breath, for movement, for any sign that time had not yet slipped too far. The man's eyes fluttered open just enough to find Daniel's face, and in that moment there was no panic there, no confusion, only a strange, steady calm, as if this meeting had been expected, as if Daniel had arrived exactly when he was meant to. Rex stood close, watching, silent now, his earlier tension replaced by something deeper, something almost knowing, his tail. Low but still, like a guard standing post over something sacred. The wind never came, the trees never stirred, and the lake remained perfectly still, but somehow the world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Daniel leaned closer as the man tried to speak, his voice barely more than a whisper carried on fading air, and though the words were broken, unclear, one thing lingered between them like a thread that refused to break. Something about the lake, something about listening, something that felt less like a warning and more like an invitation. Daniel didn't understand it yet, not fully, but he felt it settle somewhere deep inside him, the same place where old memories and quiet hopes lived side by side. And as he looked out across that silent water again, he couldn't shake the feeling that this place had been waiting, not just for the man, but for him too, because sometimes the world doesn't shout when something is about to change, it simply grows quiet enough for you to notice. The man's hand trembled slightly against Daniel's sleeve, not from fear but from the weight of something he was trying to pass on before it slipped away, and Daniel leaned closer, steady and quiet, the way he had learned to be when moments mattered more than words, while Rex lowered himself beside them, ears tilted forward, listening not just to the man, but to the silence around him, as if it carried something deeper than sound. The man's lips parted again, and this time the words came slower, broken but deliberate. "Not the house, the lake. It listens." And though Daniel did not understand, he nodded anyway, because sometimes understanding came later, and what mattered was being present when someone needed to be heard. A faint breath escaped the man's chest, softer than the wind that never came, and then his hand went still, his grip loosening as if whatever he had been holding onto had finally found its way free. Daniel stayed there for a long moment, his hand resting gently over the man's, not rushing, not moving, just allowing the quiet to settle, because he knew this kind of silence, the kind that followed something ending and something else beginning, even if you could not yet see what that beginning looked like. Rex let out a low, almost mournful whine, then stood and turned toward the lake again, his body shifting from stillness to alertness in a single breath, as if whatever had passed between the man and Daniel had not ended, but moved somewhere else entirely. Daniel followed his gaze, the surface of the water unchanged, smooth and pale under the sky, Yet something about it felt different now, heavier, as though it had taken in the moment and was holding it beneath its quiet skin. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old phone. The screen cracked, the signal weak out here, but enough to make a call, enough to ensure the man would not be left alone without acknowledgement, because no one deserved to disappear without someone noticing they had been here. While he spoke in calm, measured words, giving the location, describing what had happened, Rex began to move, not far, just a slow circle along the shoreline, nose low, tracking something invisible, stopping every few feet to look back at Daniel, as if to say this was not over yet. When the call ended, Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket and stood, his knees stiff from the cold ground. And for a moment he considered leaving, letting the authorities take over, returning to the quiet routine of surviving one day at a time. But Rex stopped and planted his paws firmly near a cluster of rocks just beyond the reeds, staring down at the earth with a focus that Daniel had learned never to ignore. "All right," he said softly, more to himself than to the dog, stepping closer, the gravel shifting beneath his boots as he crouched again, brushing aside damp leaves and loose dirt until his fingers touched something solid, something shaped, not natural, and when he cleared it enough to see, a small metal edge caught the faint light, worn but deliberate, as if it had been placed there for someone who would know to look. Rex gave a single, quiet huff, his tail moving once, slow and certain, and Daniel felt that same strange pull again, the sense that whatever had brought them here had not been chance, but something patient, something that had been waiting longer than he could imagine, because sometimes the answers do not appear when you are ready, they appear when you are willing to stay. The metal edge was colder than the air around it, smooth beneath Daniel's fingers but shaped with intention, and as he cleared away the last of the damp soil, a small iron key revealed itself, darkened by time yet untouched by rust, as if it had been protected from decay by something unseen, something patient. Daniel turned it slowly in his hand, feeling its weight, noticing the unusual engraving along the bow, a simple outline of a lake surrounded by 3 small marks that could have been trees or stones, symbols that meant nothing to him, yet carried a quiet sense of purpose. Rex remained still beside him, eyes fixed not on the key but on the lake beyond, his ears flicking at intervals too subtle for human notice, responding to something that seemed to move beneath the surface without ever breaking it. The air felt heavier now, not colder, but denser, like the moment before a storm that never quite arrives, and Daniel found himself glancing back at the man lying peacefully near the reeds, a strange calm settling over the scene as if the urgency had passed but the meaning remained. In the distance, a faint sound echoed across the water, not quite a splash, not quite a shift, but enough to draw his attention back to the lake, where the reflection of the sky shimmered for a brief second, then stilled again as if nothing had happened at all. Rex stepped forward, then paused, turning his head slightly toward Daniel, waiting, always waiting, as if this next choice mattered more than any step they had taken before. Daniel slipped the key into his jacket pocket, his fingers lingering there for a moment longer than necessary, as though he could feel something through the fabric, a quiet pull, a direction not spoken but understood. He stood slowly, his gaze sweeping across the shoreline, taking in the curve of the land, the placement of the rocks, the subtle rise of the terrain beyond the trees, and something about it began to align with the engraving he had just seen, not clearly, not perfectly, but enough to stir a memory of patterns he had once learned to trust. Rex moved again, this time with purpose, walking along the edge of the lake before veering toward a narrow path barely visible between 2 clusters of brush, a path Daniel might have missed entirely if not for the way the dog stopped just long enough to make sure he was being followed. The ground there was firmer, less disturbed, as if fewer footsteps had passed that way, and the air carried a faint scent of wet wood and stone, older somehow, untouched by the usual signs of passing time. As they moved deeper, the sound of the lake softened behind them, replaced by a quiet that felt enclosed, held within the trees, and Daniel noticed how the light shifted as well, filtering through the branches in thin, pale lines that seemed to guide rather than illuminate. After a few yards, Rex halted again, standing before a rock face partially hidden by vines and shadow, his posture alert but calm, the tension from earlier replaced by something steadier, something resolved. Daniel stepped closer, brushing aside the hanging leaves, and there, set into the stone with such subtlety it almost disappeared into the natural texture, was a small metal plate, weathered but intact, bearing the same engraving as the key in his pocket. He exhaled slowly, not in surprise, but in recognition, because whatever this was, it had been waiting not just to be found, but to be understood, and as his hand moved toward the plate, he realized that sometimes the path forward is not revealed all at once, but piece by piece, to those willing to follow where they are quietly led. Daniel's fingers hovered over the metal plate for a moment, not out of hesitation but out of respect, the kind that came from years of knowing that some doors, once opened, could not be closed the same way again, and Rex stood quietly beside him, no longer urging, no longer signaling, just present, as if whatever had guided them here had now stepped back to let the choice belong to Daniel alone. The forest around them felt still in a different way now, not empty, but attentive, like it was listening for what he would do next, and even the faint rustle of leaves seemed to pause between breaths. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the key, the cool metal fitting naturally into his grip, as though it had already learned the shape of his hand, and when he held it up to the plate, the engraving aligned perfectly, the lake, the marks, the quiet geometry of something designed long before he arrived. There was a small opening beneath the plate, nearly invisible until you knew where to look, and without overthinking it, he slid the key inside. For a brief second, nothing happened, just the sound of his own breathing and the distant memory of water behind them. And then there was a soft click, so subtle it almost felt imagined, followed by a low shift within the stone itself, like something deep inside the rock had just awakened after a long, patient sleep. Rex's ears lifted slightly, not in alarm but in recognition, and Daniel felt it too, not as a sound, but as a movement beneath his feet, a gentle vibration that traveled upward, steady and measured, like a pulse that did not belong to him. The rock face in front of them began to separate along a thin, nearly perfect seam, the motion slow and deliberate, revealing a narrow opening just wide enough for a person to pass through, and beyond it, darkness, not empty darkness, but the kind that held space, that suggested something waited within rather than nothing at all. A faint draft brushed against Daniel's face, carrying with it the scent of old wood, still water, and something else he could not quite name, something that felt both unfamiliar and deeply known at the same time. He glanced down at Rex, who met his gaze with steady eyes, the kind that did not question, did not doubt, only affirmed, and Daniel nodded once, a quiet agreement passing between them without words. Stepping forward, he crossed the threshold, the light from outside fading behind him as the narrow passage guided him inward, the walls smooth and cool beneath his fingertips, carved not roughly but with intention, as if whoever built this place had cared not just about function, but about the experience of entering it. The air grew quieter with each step, the outside world softening into memory, until even the sound of his own boots seemed distant, absorbed by the space around him. After a few yards, the passage opened slightly, enough for a dim glow to appear ahead, pale and steady, not electric, not flickering, but constant, like light reflected rather than produced, and as Daniel moved toward it, the space revealed itself piece by piece. A hidden chamber built into the rock, with wooden beams aged but intact, a small table resting against the far wall, and beyond that, through an opening carved with careful precision, the lake itself, visible from within the stone as though the house had been shaped around it rather than built beside it. The water moved differently here, not with waves or ripples, but with a slow, rhythmic motion that seemed to respond to something unseen, and Daniel felt that same quiet pull again, stronger now, not drawing him forward with urgency, but inviting him to stay, to listen, to understand. Behind him, Rex stepped into the chamber, his presence grounding, steady, and Daniel realized that whatever this place was, it was not hidden to be forgotten, but hidden to be found by the one who would not turn away when the world grew quiet enough to reveal it. The chamber held a quiet that did not feel empty but intentional, as if every surface, every beam, every inch of stone had been placed with a purpose that reached beyond simple shelter, and Daniel stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust not just to the light, but to the presence of the place itself, because it felt less like stepping into a hidden room and more like stepping into something that had been waiting to be acknowledged. Rex moved ahead slowly, his paws making almost no sound against the worn wooden floor, his nose lifting slightly as he traced the air, not searching, but recognizing, like he had entered a place that spoke a language he already understood. Daniel followed, his boots echoing faintly, and as he approached the table against the wall, he noticed how clean it was despite the age of everything else. No dust thick enough to suggest abandonment, only a thin layer as if time had passed gently here rather than heavily. Resting at the center of the table was a small leather journal, its cover worn smooth at the edges, the kind of wear that comes from being handled often, not neglected, and beside it, a lantern that gave off that same steady, pale glow he had noticed from the passage, not flickering, not fading, just present. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing the surface of the journal, and for a brief second, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of a quiet awareness that whatever was inside had been left deliberately, not hidden away, but preserved for someone who would arrive with the right questions rather than the right answers. Rex sat down near the opening that faced the lake, his gaze fixed on the water as it moved in that same slow rhythm, his ears occasionally twitching as if responding to something Daniel still could not hear, and that steady motion began to feel less like water shifting and more like something breathing, something alive in a way that did not belong to the usual world. Daniel opened the journal carefully, the pages thick and slightly yellowed but intact, and the handwriting inside was precise, measured, each line written with intention rather than haste, and though the first words were simple, they carried a weight that settled deep within him the moment he read them, as if they had been written not just to be seen, but to be understood by someone who had already walked a certain kind of path. The entries spoke of the lake, not as a place, but as something that listened, something that remembered, something that responded only to those who approached without taking, without forcing, without demanding more than they were willing to give, and Daniel found himself reading slower with each line, his breath steady, his mind quieting in a way he had not felt in years. There were sketches too, small drawings of the shoreline, the rock formations, the hidden path they had followed, all marked with subtle symbols that matched the engraving on the key, and among them, one drawing stood out, a simple outline of the chamber itself, labeled not as a house, but as a threshold. He paused at that word, letting it settle, because it felt accurate in a way he could not explain, as if this place was not meant to be owned or claimed, but crossed, experienced, and protected. Rex shifted slightly, letting out a soft breath, and Daniel looked up, following his line of sight to the water once more, where the surface seemed to respond ever so slightly, not with movement alone, but with a presence that acknowledged his awareness, and in that moment, Daniel understood something without needing it to be explained, that whatever had brought him here was not about what he would gain, but about what he would choose to carry forward, because sometimes the greatest inheritances are not things you hold, but responsibilities you accept when no one else is left to hear what the world is quietly saying. Daniel turned another page slowly, the sound of paper against paper soft but clear in the stillness, and the words that followed seemed less like writing and more like a conversation carried across time, as if the man who had written them had known exactly who would be reading and when. The entries began to shift from observation to instruction, not direct commands, but quiet guidance shaped by experience, speaking of moments when the lake would change, when its surface would move without wind, when its silence would grow heavier instead of lighter, and how those were not signs of danger, but of communication, of something reaching outward rather than inward. Daniel's brow tightened slightly as he read, not in confusion, but in recognition, because he had already seen those signs without knowing what they meant, the stillness, the ripple, the way the air seemed to pause around the water, as if listening alongside it. Rex stood again, moving closer to the opening where the lake revealed itself through stone, his posture alert but calm. And then he did something Daniel had not seen him do before. He placed one paw gently against the rock beside the opening, holding it there as if feeling for something beyond the surface, his ears tilted forward, his breathing slow and steady. Daniel watched him for a moment, then looked back to the journal, where a single line caught his attention more than the others, written slightly darker, as though pressed into the page with more intention. The lake does not speak in words, it answers in rhythm, and only those who have learned to wait can hear it clearly. The words settled into him with a quiet weight, and without thinking, he found himself standing, stepping closer to the opening, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by something deeper, something that felt like recognition rather than discovery. The water outside moved in that same slow pattern, not random, not shifting with the breeze, but pulsing in a way that mirrored something internal, something steady and alive. And Daniel realized he had felt that rhythm before, not here, but somewhere far removed, in moments of waiting, in moments where time stretched, and every second mattered, when listening was more important than acting. Rex let out a soft sound, not a bark, not a growl, but something in between, and Daniel placed his hand against the stone beside him, just as the dog had done, the surface cool beneath his palm, unmoving at first, until gradually, almost imperceptibly, he felt it, a faint vibration, steady and consistent, like a distant echo traveling through the rock. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to focus, to allow the noise of everything else to fall away. And in that quiet, the rhythm became clearer, not louder, but more defined, like a pattern waiting to be recognized rather than heard. When he opened his eyes again, the lake seemed different, not in appearance, but in presence, as if it was no longer something separate from him, but something aware of him, something that had acknowledged his willingness to listen. He stepped back slowly, his gaze shifting between the water and the journal, and for the first time, the pieces began to align in a way that felt complete rather than fragmented. The man by the shore, the key beneath the stone, the path through the trees, the chamber within the rock, all of it forming something intentional, something designed not to be stumbled upon, but to be followed. Rex moved back to his side, his body relaxed now, his earlier tension replaced by a quiet certainty, and Daniel understood that whatever this place required, it was not strength, not urgency, not even understanding at first, but patience, the kind that did not force answers, but allowed them to emerge in their own time. Because sometimes the truth is not hidden from you. It is waiting for you to become still enough to receive it. Daniel remained by the opening longer than he realized, his hand still resting lightly against the stone as if removing it too quickly might break whatever fragile connection had just formed, and the rhythm beneath his palm continued, steady and patient, not demanding his attention but accepting it, as though the act of listening was enough. Rex shifted beside him, then stepped forward again, this time lowering himself fully onto the wooden floor with his head resting between his paws, eyes still fixed on the water, calm in a way that suggested not just awareness, but trust, the kind of trust that comes when something unknown no longer feels threatening. Daniel drew a slow breath and stepped back from the opening, turning once more to the journal on the table, his movements quieter now, more deliberate, as if he had begun to understand that this place responded not to haste, but to intention. He flipped to the next page, and the handwriting there had changed slightly, not in style, but in tone, as though the writer had shifted from describing the lake to speaking directly to the one who would stand here next. If you have come this far, the line began, then you have already done the hardest part. You stayed when leaving would have been easier. Daniel paused, the words settling deeper than he expected, because they felt less like guidance and more like recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of choices he had made long before he ever reached this place. The entry continued, speaking of the responsibility that followed, not in terms of ownership, but of stewardship, of being present when the lake called, of listening when others would dismiss what they could not explain, and of protecting the balance between what is seen and what remains beneath the surface. Daniel's gaze drifted back toward the water, the steady motion unchanged, yet now it felt less distant, less separate, as though it had accepted his presence not as a visitor, but as something closer to a participant. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears flicking toward the passage behind them for a brief moment, then returning to the lake, a small reminder that the world outside still existed, still moved forward, even as this place seemed to exist outside of time. Daniel closed the journal gently, his hand resting on its cover as he considered everything he had read, everything he had felt, and the quiet truth began to take shape within him, not as a sudden realization, but as a steady understanding that grew stronger with each passing second. He had not been brought here to take something, not even to uncover a secret, but to become part of something that required care, attention, and above all, presence. The thought did not feel heavy, did not feel like a burden, but rather like a missing piece settling into place, something he had been searching for without knowing it had a name. He moved toward the opening once more, standing beside Rex, both of them facing the lake in silence. And for a moment, nothing changed, no movement, no sound beyond that steady rhythm beneath the surface, until gradually, almost imperceptibly, the water shifted, not outward, but inward, drawing itself toward a single point before smoothing again, as if acknowledging not just that he was there, but that he understood. Daniel let out a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding, his shoulders easing, his stance grounding, and in that stillness, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not relief, not certainty, but a sense of belonging that did not depend on where he had come from or what he had lost, only on the fact that he had chosen to stay when it mattered. And as the chamber held that quiet around him, he understood that some places do not change your life all at once. They simply offer you a place where you can begin to change it yourself. The stillness in the chamber did not fade, but it changed, becoming something more active, more aware, as if the space itself had accepted Daniel's presence and was now waiting to see what he would do with it. And he found himself turning slowly, taking in the details he had missed before, the way the wooden beams curved slightly as though shaped to follow the natural lines of the rock, the way the lantern's glow never flickered despite the absence of any visible fuel, and the way the air carried a faint warmth that did not come from fire, but from something deeper, something steady. Rex rose to his feet again, stretching lightly before walking toward the far side of the chamber where a narrow shelf had been carved into the stone wall, his nose tracing along its surface until he stopped at a small object Daniel had not yet noticed, a metal box no larger than a paperback book, its surface etched with the same lake symbol, worn but clear. Daniel stepped closer, crouching beside the dog, and for a moment he simply looked at the box without touching it, because by now he understood that nothing here was placed without meaning, and that every action carried weight beyond the physical. He reached out slowly and lifted the lid, which opened without resistance, as if it had never been sealed, revealing a folded piece of paper inside, thicker than the pages of the journal, preserved carefully against time. When he unfolded it, the edges cracked softly, but the writing remained sharp, deliberate, and unmistakably intentional. It was not a letter in the usual sense, but something closer to a record, a passing of responsibility written in a tone that carried both certainty and quiet hope. The words spoke of the one who would come after, not named, not described, but understood through action rather than identity, someone who would arrive not seeking ownership, but responding to a call they could not ignore. Daniel read each line slowly, his breath steady, his mind clear, and as he did, he felt something settle within him, not as a decision, but as an acceptance that had already begun forming long before this moment. Rex remained beside him, calm and grounded, his presence steady, as if confirming what Daniel was beginning to understand, that this place, this responsibility, was not about what had been left behind, but about what would continue forward. Outside, the lake shifted again, this time more noticeably, a gentle inward motion that drew the surface toward a central point before releasing it back into stillness, like a breath taken and let go. And Daniel looked up, the connection between the movement and the words in his hands no longer something he questioned. He folded the paper carefully and placed it back inside the box, closing the lid with the same quiet care, then stood, turning toward the opening once more, the light from the lake casting soft reflections along the stone walls. For the first time since arriving, he did not feel like a visitor standing at the edge of something unknown, but like someone who had stepped into a role that had been waiting, not assigned by force, but offered through trust. Rex moved to his side, his tail brushing lightly against Daniel's leg, and together they stood facing the water, not searching, not questioning, just present, allowing the moment to exist without needing to define it. And in that quiet, Daniel realized that whatever came next would not be revealed all at once, but slowly, in pieces, in rhythms, in moments that required him to remain still enough to notice, because some paths are not shown by signs or maps, but by the willingness to listen when the world grows quiet enough to speak. Daniel did not rush to leave the chamber, even as the thought of the world outside returned to the edges of his awareness, because something in him understood that stepping away too quickly would mean missing what this place still had to reveal. And so he remained, standing beside Rex, watching the lake through the stone opening as the slow rhythm continued, steady and unbroken. The light outside had shifted slightly, the gray sky softening toward a pale blue, and for the first time, a faint breeze moved across the surface, yet the water near the chamber remained different, insulated somehow, responding not to the wind, but to that same quiet pulse that now felt familiar rather than strange. Rex moved first, stepping closer to the edge of the opening, his body leaning forward just enough to suggest attention without urgency. And then he did something subtle but unmistakable. He looked back at Daniel, not as a signal to follow, but as an invitation to witness. Daniel stepped forward, his boots stopping just short of the stone threshold, and as he focused on the water, he noticed something he had not seen before, a faint line beneath the surface, not a reflection, not a shadow, but a shape, moving slowly in alignment with the rhythm, appearing and disappearing as if it existed just beyond clear sight. He narrowed his eyes slightly, not straining, but allowing the image to form in its own time, and gradually, the shape became clearer, not fully defined, but enough to suggest structure, something beneath the water that mirrored the chamber itself, a continuation rather than a separate entity. His breath caught for a brief moment, not in shock, but in recognition, because it made sense in a way that felt inevitable, as if everything he had seen so far had been leading to this understanding, that the place he stood in was only part of something larger, something layered between what could be seen and what chose to remain hidden. Rex let out a soft exhale, settling down again, his posture relaxed, as if the discovery was not new to him, only new to Daniel, and that quiet assurance grounded him, reminding him that he was not alone in this, not truly. Daniel stepped back slightly, his gaze shifting between the water and the interior of the chamber, and the pieces continued to align, the journal, the key, the markings, the rhythm, all of it forming a pattern that no longer felt like coincidence, but intention. He moved toward the table once more, his hand resting briefly on the journal before sliding it closed, not as an end, but as a pause, a recognition that what he needed to understand next would not be found on the page, but in what he was willing to observe and accept. Outside, the sound of distant movement reached him faintly, voices carried across the water, subtle but present, a reminder that others would soon arrive, that the world beyond this place was already catching up to what had happened at the shore. Rex's ears lifted slightly at the sound, but he did not move, his attention still anchored to Daniel, to the moment, to the quiet space they occupied together. Daniel looked toward the passage they had entered through, then back to the lake, and for a brief second, the decision presented itself, to leave now and return to what was familiar, or to stay just a little longer and allow this place to continue unfolding at its own pace. He chose to stay, not out of defiance, but out of trust, the same trust that had led him to follow Rex in the first place, the same trust that had kept him by the man's side until the end. The lake responded, not dramatically, not with any sudden change, but with a subtle deepening of that steady rhythm, as if acknowledging his choice. And in that moment, Daniel understood that this was not a place that revealed everything at once, but one that offered its truths in layers to those willing to remain long enough to receive them. Because sometimes the most important discoveries are not the ones you find, but the ones you allow to find you when you decide not to walk away. The faint voices drifting across the lake grew clearer now, carried gently over the water like echoes from a world Daniel had almost forgotten. And for a moment he stood still, caught between two realities, one that moved with noise and urgency, and one that asked only for stillness and attention, and he realized that whatever choice he made next would not separate those worlds, but define how he moved between them. Rex lifted his head again, ears angled toward the distant sound, then back toward Daniel, as if reminding him that time outside had not paused, even if this place seemed untouched by it. Daniel exhaled slowly and stepped away from the opening, turning once more to take in the chamber, the table, the journal, the quiet light that did not fade, and the stone walls that felt less like barriers and more like guardians of something that did not belong to just anyone. He moved with intention now, not wandering, not searching, but acknowledging, his hand brushing lightly along the surface of the table, then resting for a brief moment on the journal, not to take it, but to leave it as it had been found, because something told him this place did not require removal, only respect. Rex stood and followed, his movements steady and calm, no longer driven by instinct alone, but by something quieter, something that had settled into him the same way it had settled into Daniel. As they approached the passage, Daniel paused, glancing back one last time at the lake framed within stone, and in that moment, the rhythm beneath the surface deepened slightly, not louder, but more present, as if offering a final acknowledgement, not a farewell, but a recognition that he would return, not out of obligation, but because something here had become part of him. He stepped into the passage, the light behind him softening as the narrow walls guided him outward, and with each step, the sounds of the outside world grew clearer, the distant voices, the faint movement of wind through trees, the subtle reminder that life continued beyond the quiet of the chamber. When he emerged back into the forest, the air felt different against his skin, lighter, more familiar, yet something within him had shifted, something that made even the ordinary feel slightly changed. The path no longer seemed hidden, the rocks no longer random, and the lake, visible once more through the trees, carried a presence he now recognized rather than questioned. Near the shoreline, figures had gathered, their movements careful, their voices low, and Daniel could see the outline of the man he had found earlier, now surrounded by people who had arrived too late to meet him, yet not too late to acknowledge him. Daniel approached slowly, Rex at his side, and no one questioned his presence. No one asked why he had been there first, because sometimes the answers people look for are not spoken, they are simply understood. A man in a uniform nodded briefly, his expression respectful, and Daniel returned the gesture without words, because there was nothing to explain that would make sense in the way they would expect. Rex remained close, his gaze shifting once toward the lake, then back to Daniel, calm and steady, as if confirming that everything that needed to happen had already begun. Daniel stood there for a moment, watching as the scene unfolded, the quiet coordination, the respectful silence, and he felt no urgency to leave, no need to escape, only a grounded awareness that this was part of the same story, not separate from it. And as he turned his gaze once more toward the water, catching a brief, subtle shift beneath its surface that no one else seemed to notice, he understood that some inheritances are not announced, not handed over in clear terms, but revealed through moments that ask nothing from you except that you remain present enough to recognize them when they arrive. The activity near the shoreline moved with quiet coordination, voices low, footsteps careful, and Daniel remained just outside the center of it all, not withdrawn, but not fully part of it either, standing in that familiar space where he had spent much of his life, present but unnoticed, seen but not questioned, and for once, it did not feel like distance, it felt like clarity. Rex stood beside him, his posture relaxed, his breathing even, his attention no longer scanning for danger, but resting in a steady awareness that mirrored Daniel's own, as if both of them had crossed into something that did not require constant vigilance. A man approached Daniel after a few minutes, not hurried, not demanding, but with the quiet professionalism of someone used to stepping into moments that mattered, his badge catching a brief reflection of light as he introduced himself in a calm, respectful tone, asking simple questions, where Daniel had been, what he had seen, how long the man had been there. Daniel answered without hesitation, his words steady, clear, offering only what was needed, nothing more, nothing less, because some details do not belong to explanation, they belong to experience. The officer nodded, taking in each word without interruption, and there was a subtle shift in his expression, not suspicion, but understanding, the kind that comes when someone recognizes that not everything can be fully explained and not everything needs to be. Rex remained still throughout the exchange, his presence grounding, his quiet gaze occasionally shifting toward the lake, then back to Daniel, as if reminding him that what had happened here extended beyond the visible moment. When the conversation ended, the officer gave a small nod of appreciation and stepped away, returning to the others, and Daniel found himself once again facing the water, the surface calm, unbroken, yet carrying that same underlying rhythm he now recognized without needing to feel it directly. The light had shifted further, the sky opening into a soft blue that reflected across the lake in long, gentle stretches, and for a moment, everything appeared ordinary, the kind of ordinary that most people would accept without question, yet Daniel could see beyond it now, not with his eyes alone, but with something deeper, something that had been awakened rather than taught. Rex moved a few steps closer to the water's edge, then stopped, turning slightly as if checking whether Daniel would follow. And Daniel did, not because he was told to, but because he understood that this connection was not bound to the hidden chamber alone. It extended here, into the open, into the place where others stood without seeing what lay beneath. He crouched slightly, his gaze steady on the surface, and for a brief moment, the reflection shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but just enough for him to recognize the familiar pattern beneath, the same subtle movement he had seen from within the stone, now present even here, though quieter, more restrained, as if the lake revealed itself differently depending on who was looking. Rex let out a soft breath and sat beside him, his body at ease, and Daniel realized that this was how it would be, not constant revelation, not overwhelming change, but small, quiet confirmations that would appear when he was still enough to notice them. He stood again, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze lifting from the water to the trees, to the sky, to the people moving in the distance, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like someone passing through. He felt anchored, not by place, but by purpose. And as the moment settled around him, he understood that some roles are not given through words or documents, but through moments that leave no doubt, moments that quietly say, you are here because you chose to stay when it mattered, and now, what you do next will shape what remains. The afternoon light stretched longer across the lake now, turning the surface into a sheet of soft gold and pale blue, and the voices behind Daniel had begun to fade as people moved on, their tasks complete, their presence temporary, leaving the shoreline quieter than before, though not as silent as when he first arrived. Rex remained beside him, calm and steady, his attention no longer divided, as if whatever had needed to be noticed had already been seen, and what remained now was something quieter, something that would not reveal itself through urgency, but through time. Daniel took a slow step closer to the water, his boots pressing gently into the damp earth, and for a moment he simply stood there, not searching, not expecting, just present, allowing the stillness to settle around him again, though now it felt different, no longer unfamiliar, no longer distant, but something he had already begun to understand. The lake responded in the same subtle way, a faint shift beneath the surface, not visible to anyone else, but unmistakable to him, a quiet recognition that did not need to announce itself. He glanced down at Rex, who met his gaze briefly before looking back toward the water, his posture relaxed, as if confirming that nothing needed to be forced, that everything would unfold as it was meant to. Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the weight of uncertainty pressing against him, not because he had answers, but because he no longer needed them in the same way. The path behind him, the hidden chamber, the journal, the key, all of it remained where it belonged, untouched, undisturbed, not lost, but preserved, and he understood now that it was not something to be taken away, but something to return to, something that would remain constant even as everything else changed. The breeze moved lightly across the surface, creating small ripples that faded almost as quickly as they appeared, yet beneath them, that steady rhythm continued, quiet and patient, like a heartbeat that did not depend on being heard to exist. Daniel turned slightly, looking once more at the place where the man had been found, now empty, marked only by the faint impression in the grass, and he felt no heaviness there, no lingering sorrow, only a quiet sense that something had been completed exactly as it needed to be. Rex stepped forward a few paces, then paused, glancing back once, a simple gesture that carried no urgency, only invitation, and Daniel followed, not away from the lake, but along its edge, his steps unhurried, his attention open, aware of the subtle changes in light, in sound, in the way the air moved around them. As they walked, The shoreline curved gently, revealing new angles of the water, new reflections, and with each shift, Daniel felt that same quiet connection remain, not fading with distance, but extending, as if the place itself was not confined to a single point, but lived within the rhythm he had learned to recognize. The trees whispered softly above, their leaves catching the light, and the world around him felt both ordinary and deeply changed at the same time, not because it had transformed, but because he had. And as the lake stretched out beside him, steady and endless, Daniel understood that what had been given to him was not something he could hold in his hands, but something he would carry in the way he moved forward, in the way he listened, in the way he chose to stay present even when nothing seemed to be happening. Because sometimes the greatest gifts are not the ones that change your circumstances, but the ones that quietly change the way you see everything that was already there. The path along the lake stretched quietly ahead, curving through the trees as the last light of day softened everything it touched, and Daniel walked without urgency, Rex moving beside him with the same steady rhythm they had shared for years. Yet something about this moment felt different, not because the world had changed, but because the weight he had carried for so long no longer pressed against him in the same way. The air held a gentle warmth now, the kind that comes just before evening settles in, and the lake beside them reflected the sky in long, quiet streaks, its surface calm, yet alive with that subtle presence Daniel had come to recognize not with his eyes, but with something deeper. Rex slowed his pace slightly, then stopped, turning his head toward the water, his ears lifting just enough to signal attention, and Daniel paused as well, following his gaze, not expecting anything dramatic, not searching for proof, only allowing himself to be still in the same way he had learned within the stone chamber. For a few seconds, nothing changed. The surface remained smooth, the breeze barely noticeable, and then, almost imperceptibly, a faint ripple formed near the center of the lake, not spreading outward, but drawing inward, a quiet motion that mirrored the rhythm he had felt before, steady and deliberate, as if the lake itself was acknowledging his presence once more. Daniel did not move closer, did not reach out. He simply stood there, breathing slowly, letting the moment exist without trying to hold on to it, and Rex settled beside him, his body relaxed, his tail resting lightly against the ground, both of them sharing the same quiet understanding without needing to act on it. The ripple faded just as gently as it had appeared, leaving the surface smooth again, and Daniel felt a calm certainty settle within him, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning, something that would not demand his attention constantly, but would be there whenever he chose to listen. He turned his gaze away from the water and looked ahead to the path, the trees stretching out in soft shadows, the world continuing forward in its usual way, and for the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was walking without direction. He felt guided, not by signs or instructions, but by something quieter, something that asked only that he remain aware, remain present, remain willing to return when it mattered. Rex stood and took a step forward, then another, glancing back briefly as if to confirm Daniel was ready, and Daniel followed, his steps steady, his posture grounded, no longer carrying the same uncertainty that had once defined him. The lake remained beside them for a while longer before the path gradually led them away, the trees growing denser, the water disappearing from view, yet the connection did not fade with distance. It remained, quiet and constant, like a rhythm that continued even when it could no longer be heard. As the last light of the day slipped behind the trees and the first hint of evening settled in, Daniel felt something settle within him as well, not a resolution, not an ending, but a quiet acceptance of what had been given and what would be asked of him moving forward. And as he walked on, with Rex at his side and the world unfolding one step at a time, he understood something simple and true, that sometimes the greatest inheritances are not found in what you receive, but in what you choose to carry forward, and the way you choose to listen when everything around you grows still enough to speak.